This is Duke University.
My name is Ara Wilson. I'm in the Department of Women's Studies and Cultural Anthropology here at Duke University, and I'm really happy to have these participants on this panel. I want to thank the organizers for letting several of us curate these panels, and even though it was really decentralized, it sort of shows how decentralized can work in a really interesting way as opposed to top-down. And so I want to thank Miriam and Erdag, and my thoughts go out to Erdag today. So I'm not going to really introduce the speakers because this is a great and sort of thorough identity. I'm going to say a few opening remarks before we turn to it. We will be going in the order that's listed there. So Yan Song from Chapel Hill will be going first, Burak Erdem from North Carolina State University next, and then Brenda Chalfrin from University of Florida will be going third. So I'm always sort of thrilled to see this many people at something called infrastructure. And I'm teaching a course on infrastructure, and I found that when I went out at my national meetings or some other places, people went cool, and it was like, wow, there's clearly been an interesting shift that's happened where there's a real turn for a lot of our critical sort of interdisciplinary fields to thinking about infrastructure and turning to it as an interesting rubric. I think there are a number of reasons for that, and one of the things is that I think that a lot of the new and interesting critical work creates a possibility of engaging with certain types of materialism, very much connected with other sort of ontological turns or turns to the living thing or decentering of the human and things like that, in a way that doesn't necessarily, in a way that resists teleological determinism, technological determinism, or a certain type of materialist reductionism, physicalism, or something in that sense. And in that sense, I think it pulls together a number of fields. But I want to say that when you go to the technical literature, one of the things you're struck by is the fact that the definitions for infrastructure in the technical literature are themselves open-ended. They can't quite pin it down, because there's sewage systems, but then there's digital technologies. And the definitions themselves have to incorporate design, bits of information, coordination, things like that. The economic definitions sound almost radical in the sense that many of them actually think about infrastructure as a certain type of social capital, but they definitely think about it or define it in such a way that it sounds inherently public or inherently connected to some sort of government oversight and funding. And so the concept of infrastructure typically gets us to the very heart of debates or concerns with neoliberalism and the sense of privatization or what the public should fund or what can count as a kind of publicly provisioned commons or is it a commons and things like that. So I think it's a rubric with legs to anthropomorphize it or pause to sort of open up the species sort of categories and things like that. And so it's been a wonderful sort of, I think, category to think through. There's a wonderful article by Rankin that looks at a bit of the, not quite etymology, but the history of the term. And it's interesting how recent it is in terms of a really popular and broad term. And one of the things he really traces is how it went from being a kind of more technical military jargon term to become more popularized very much in the sort of post-World War II conversations about development, about how to pay for development, about Cold War concerns, and so it was very much built, and about ideas about modernization and development. And so if one bears in mind the history of the term, it was a transnational term, and concerns with very much a geopolitics, questions of public investment, questions of how do we provision for populations and how do we develop nations and, for some, prevent communism, for some, advance communism, was very much how the term got popularized, and very much through bodies like the United Nations. So the term itself has this interesting conception that also links it up to public provisioning, links it up to geopolitics, and things like that. So it's funny that it has now a technical cast. It has a technical cast that we feel like we're reanimating with these critical concerns, but actually they were there from sort of when it got popularized in the World War II context. So we're hearing these 3 different cases today, but I think that we'll see sort of the really interesting resonance of all that, of the sort of inherited meanings and new meanings of infrastructure. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Yan Song from UNC Chapel Hill.
Thank you, Ara. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on Saturday morning. My name is Yan Song, and I'm going to just give you story in terms of the recent infrastructure investment and development in China. So I just want to show you some pictures here to show you the trend of developments in, again, urban developments in China. First of all, I'm going to show us three cities. This is from Shenzhen, and it's a city very close to Hong Kong, just across the border. And this is a picture in 1985. And you see mostly fields, still agricultural land. You see a little bit ribbons of the roads. 7 years later, you see this roads being, the infrastructure being put in. And then another 5 years later, you see just exactly the same spot. Okay, those are all from high-resolution satellite image time series. You see the same spot, lots of residential, commercial developments, and in the middle of that, it's the city hall, the new city hall of the city, right? Really beautiful design. Another angle, right? And this is another spot, and you see again in 1985, some preliminary roads, especially to the south, it's just the oyster farming land. And then 5 years later, again, a freeway being put in to the south of the of this spot, and you see a lot of commercial developments being put in. Another spot, and this is the infrastructure of a port, right? And this is in 85, the land has been cleared for future development, and then 7 years later, and this is Yantian Port, now the 7th largest port in the world. Okay. Just another picture showing you the current scenery of that port. All right, take a look at Shanghai, and this is the Pudong district. And I can say, 15 years ago it wasn't look like this. 20 years ago it wasn't there, right? But look at this statistic below. This is what I calculated from the data from Bureau of Statistics. So in very 20 years, in the city of Shanghai alone, the new construction area totaled more than 24 billion square feet. That's 9,000 Empire buildings, okay, and Empire State buildings. And this is brought, of course, by lots of investment in infrastructure. And this is Beijing, right? And probably many of you know the headquarters of the the main anchor of the TV station, CCTV station, and lots of new buildings again in the CBD. But look at some of the data from World Bank. So since the 1980s, China has built more. I would say I've emphasized highways, bridges, tunnels, all this kind of infrastructure than all the other countries combined. Right, so with this in the context, I'm going to just talk more into the story of infrastructure development in China, the recent trend, the impacts of infrastructure or on urban developments, and some of the interjection of urban infrastructure and urban form. Okay, so infrastructure in China has been used purposefully and on purpose as a growth generator. Okay, in a lot of hinterland area, the government has the saying that if you want to develop, build the roads first. Right. So with the idea that the infrastructure will bring in the economic and spatial growth, right, to attract private investments, to brand the cities, right, with for example many different kinds of infrastructure that I will show in a minute. And very recently, in the bigger context of urbanization in China, the infrastructure has been used as a way to stimulate consumption as well. Okay, and in between 2011 and 2015, there's a huge investment there. In terms of U.S. dollar, is a little bit more than $1 trillion in just 5 years. And this is just a graph showing you that using railway investment as an example over the years, especially after the economic sort of opening up from the 70s, the investment in infrastructure has just skyrocketed over time, although declined a little bit in recent years due to economic sort of slowing down. And you might wonder, right, where are those investments happening? In the very beginning of urban growth in China, most of the investment happened in the East Coast area. That's the sort of the most developed region in China. But in recent years, in the past decade, lots of re-emphasis has been moved toward the West region. Right? As you can see, develop the West, and for a lot of types of infrastructure, the investment amount actually in West surpassed the investment in the East. Okay? Although the central part and the Northeast, that's sort of the Rust Belt, similar to what's going on in the U.S., still is lagging behind. But overall, the West region combined for the first time in 2007 is overpassing the East region as the sort of regional allocation of investment of infrastructure. And just in terms of subway infrastructure investment, okay, most of the infrastructure is still happening in the eastern part of the country, just purely because the eastern part of the country has larger cities. And this is an amazing number. More than 850 kilometers of a subway system are put into the cities. And high-speed rail. Okay, if you can read Chinese, this is an advertisement for high-speed rail development in China. It says by 2020 you can take the high-speed rail and just a tour through the whole country of China in one day. In one day, so you can take the high-speed rail again all through across the country with its rebounds of the network, and go through this in one day. And this is just a picture showing you the investment or infrastructure. I mean, the high-speed rail combined with subway system stations in the city of Shenzhen that I showed you the picture of City Hall. It's right underneath of that public building, and this is where this high-speed rail and subway rail stations are happening now, and it's going to be put in use by the end of next year. And Aerotropolis is another type of recent infrastructure that's going on in China. Many of you probably haven't heard of the word Aerotropolis. It's a combination of metropolis and airport. Okay. So the idea is that airport is no longer just a logistic function oriented. It's also a port, a node that not only supports logistics but also commercial real estate economic developments. And a professor, Jack Casada at UNC, he's the inventor of the word Aerotropolis, and he and I worked in the city of Zhengzhou and a couple other cities in China to develop this kind of idea. So taking Zhengzhou, this is a city in central China, as an example. And the graph below it shows the design of the airport in the new region, right? But the main idea is that Foxconn, the company, is going to relocate from Shenzhen to Zhengzhou, and I would bet that your iPads, iPods, iPhones are probably produced there, either in Shenzhen or Zhengzhou. Okay, 99% of Apple products are produced over there. And look at this chain of production and redistribution. Okay, for example, through air, the company needs to get Bluetooth, GPS, right, and sensors from Mountain View in California, right, and getting other supplies from all across the country, all across the world, and then again through the air, it distributes to USA for the final products, and that's where then in the market you can get your products from all the Apple stores. Okay. So this type of Aerotropolis type of infrastructure has been really sort of new recent trend, and it's going on in more than a dozen cities in China. All right, you might be wondering, where is this money coming from? Okay, we're talking about $1 trillion US in just 5 years, right? Where is this money coming from? And I will come back to talk about some really interesting things going on there. But this is just a big picture overview in terms of the sources of financing mechanisms. Total of 7 sources. The allocation from the top, from the central government, and local budgetary allocation, bonds, and so on. Okay, and it's more and more diversified. But look at this picture that I want to show you. There's something really interesting going on here, which is that, well, the central budgetary allocation is declining over time. So basically the Department of Finance at the top is saying, okay, you guys go ahead, do whatever you want, but you guys are going to be responsible for where the money is coming from. So this red line is where interesting things are happening. This is from local budgetary allocation. Okay, and this is from where? And this is probably the story you heard most from the media. Land grab, okay, lots of contention. And this is what we call land revenues. Okay, this is how the local governments get their money from selling the land. Okay, I will come back to this issue later. But just keep in mind, there are different ways of financing all this interesting and exciting infrastructure. But some of those might not be sustainable, but we'll come back to visit that issue again. So now let me switch my gear to talk about the impacts of infrastructure on urban developments. With the planning efforts in terms of expanding and investing on infrastructure, there are a lot of things happening in conjunction, typically on urban expansion, urban land prices, and urban land conversion. Okay. Because time limitation here, I'm not going to go through the details here, but I just want to give you a couple of ideas. I'm not going to go through this, don't be scared. So my colleagues and I collected the data from more than 200 cities in 260 cities in China. We look at the scope of urban expansion, so how cities expand over time. And we did a cross-sectional study. Basically, we look at all the types of infrastructure: bus, streets, express highway, rail center, airport, and the infrastructure investment in proportion of GDP. We look at how those infrastructure really affect the urban scale and land prices. Okay. Essentially, the key idea here is that the infrastructure did help with urban expansion, right? Just by looking at the cross-sectional data of more than 200 cities. Less so on land price, just because lots of land that the government encouraged to develop was based on subsidy. But in general, the infrastructure did help with, in terms of spatially, okay, in terms of spatially, urban expansion, and economically, the increase of urban land price. And let's further look at urban land conversion. Remember the story that I showed you at the very beginning about Shenzhen, how the infrastructure being put in and so on. So we used satellite data over time and identified those land that were converted into urban use from non-urban use, for example, agriculture land and so on, between 1904 and 2005. Okay. The red spots indicated that during those 10 years, those were converted into urban use in just one single city. Okay. And again, we look at those land in relation to infrastructure, for example, distance to nearest roads, to subway corridor, and to so the infrastructure density. Again, the story here showed that within a city over time, the market signal here is that when infrastructure is put in, the developers do respond to that sort of public confidence, and they responded by developing. And in this case, remember that I said the infrastructure is used to stimulate private investments, and we see that it is true. The developers are responding to that by putting more investments onto the ground for development. Okay. So then with all this, what I has just described, right? We've seen that lots of developments in the infrastructure. We've seen that infrastructure does have an impact on urban growth, and then we need to really calm down here and think about some of the issues that are related to this bigger trend, right? So here I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the issues related to the financing structure. Right? Mostly, is this financing resource sustainable, and is this this urban form brought by infrastructure really sustainable? Okay. As I just mentioned, the financing scheme has been really focused on land financing over time in the recent years. Okay, and this is just one showing that the local government is so into selling the land to the developers. Okay, and the idea is that in the rural area, when the farmers are selling their land, and the rural land is being converted into urban land, the government makes money from that transaction. Okay, because there's a huge difference in terms of price between urban land and rural land. And by selling that, the farmers can have their status changed from farmers to urban residents. Okay? And by selling their houses, their farm houses in the rural area, and mostly those are low density and now being converted into high-rise building in the city, the government saved furthermore land, right? They can make even more money because they are condensing this portion of land. And by doing that, the farmers are getting high-rise units in the city, and by giving up their low-density housing, rural housing in the rural area. And this basically is this discrepancy between rural and urban in terms of land prices, and that's how the government is using this discrepancy in the transaction to have local revenue resources, and then further invest that into infrastructure. Okay, very quickly, you can see if people are really satisfied, those farmers are really satisfied with this scheme. According to our survey, the big picture here is that the older farmers are less satisfactory about this transaction because they are probably used to what they have in terms of the lifestyle, and it's difficult for them to be used to this new sort of urban style of living. But anyhow, this is really a hot topic in China now. Just not only just because of equity issue, sustainable sources of land, but sometimes in terms of mechanism that the local governments are going out to grab the land. There are a lot of news on this, really hot, really politically contentious. Okay? So you might be asking the question if this is really sustainable type of sources for financing the infrastructure. Some other alternatives have been talked in the planning field, right? Maybe property tax, maybe land value capture. It's a new idea where that when you see, for example, high-speed rail and subway rail coming in, the land adjacent will increase the price, and the government might be able to capture that increment of price and further reallocate that part of the increase into infrastructure investment. Hong Kong, Tokyo have been really two greatest cities in the world in terms of using this financing scheme finance their subway system and other types of infrastructure. So this is under discussion in China now. There are a lot of pilot cases going on to explore alternative sources of infrastructure investment. And a couple final words on urban form. Right? As we mentioned, infrastructure really stimulated urban growth. But is this form sustainable? As you can see, lots of infrastructure roads are really wide, auto-oriented, not pedestrian-friendly. Okay? And this is the auto highways in Zhengzhou, the new CBD. As you can see, really just free highways, not pedestrian-friendly. Subway stations are being put in the rich neighborhoods where people are not taking subways, right? That's really ironic. And the lack of integration of different modes. For example, this is really beautiful high-speed station, but it's not really connected with the inner city subway, for example, subway stations and so on, right? So all those are sustainability issues associated with urban form. Encouragingly, we have seen a lot of new sort of a reversing trend in terms of promoting sustainable infrastructure and urban form. And those are under the names of green city, low carbon city, transit-oriented metropolis. With that, we hope to see the sort of more recent trend that will promoting not only just the economic development, but also sustainable urban form and lifestyle in China.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you again, everyone. I wanted to thank the organizers for this really outstanding conference, to Miriam, Erda, unfortunately can't be here, but Ara for chairing this panel, and Iman and many others for this conference. Really, I think the multidisciplinary nature of the approaches have been really enjoyable and productive. Just to say that briefly, I've really enjoyed that these 3 days. So, yeah, so I think I'm going to be providing a bit of a prehistory of this idea, or to use the Walter Benjamin term, of this idea of infrastructure and neoliberalism that we're coping with or dealing with from different ways. And industrialization and the rise of the metropolis, with its political economy of land speculation and surplus value production, have been typically examined as the primary causes of housing shortages and social conflicts over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of the early and varying responses to the metropolis came in the form of housing as an alternative to social unrest and revolution. For instance, Ebenezer Howard's proposed a move away from the metropolis to the Garden City as a, quote, peaceful path to real reform, and peaceful is the operative word there, in his 1898 book by pretty much the same title. And of course, Le Corbusier offered a radical transformation of the land use patterns of the city based on high-rise residential blocks in his book Towards an Architecture, where one can also find his well-known aphorism, architecture or revolution, a central fear of the merchant class. Responses during the period between the two world wars, from Weimar Germany to fascist Italy or to New Deal America, all continue to focus on the issue of worker housing as a way to drive the masses away from the centers, city centers, into well-organized rural or suburban compounds. Yeah. So I don't want to insult your knowledge on this, just wanted to have a quick connection between housing and revolution. So what I would like to share with you today is part of a larger project that examines a number of interconnected settings during the post-World War II period, where housing as a social and economic response preceded the negative effects of industrial development and finance capitalism. In these settings, housing and construction was conceptualized as an economic infrastructure and as the foundation of national planning and development projects, with ties to transnational systems of finance and governance. Within these contexts, products and settings of American domesticity were not just instruments of Cold War propaganda, as examined most extensively in Greg Castillo's wonderful book, Cold War on the Home Front, The Soft Power of Mid-Century Design. The financing, production, and organization of systems of housing and construction comprised the very components of a world economic infrastructure. My study of the conceptualization of housing and community planning as the foundation of a macro system or a world system or a global system initially focused on the work of Charles Abrams, a New York labor lawyer and a housing policy expert who soon after the publication of his widely acclaimed book, Revolution in Land, in 1939, became one of the most sought-after United Nations experts in housing and housing finance during the post-war period. Even though my study has now branched out to include other agents operating within a network of agencies, etc., Abrams continues to hold center stage as an influential figure in the conceptualization and dissemination of the underlying principles of this infrastructure. When Abrams documented his life's work as a UN expert in his last publication, Man's Struggle for Shelter in an Urbanizing World, 1964, to kind of bookend his career, he framed his role primarily as an expert who was responding to existing shortages in adequate housing and physical and administrative infrastructure across the world. You see him in the field there. However, a closer analysis of his work, which requires a filtering of his Cold War rhetoric, and I discussed this elsewhere, the reports and documents from this period have to be analyzed, cross-examined with other letters or other reports by other agents, because they're riddled with sort of to their audience. So, for example, if Abrams is writing a report, his audience is usually the UN, and he's trying to get the UN's attention to do a project. So what he's saying, you can't take it for granted. You have to sort of cross-examine it. So that's the filtering of the Cold War rhetoric. But this shows that Abrams saw housing, that cross-examination reveals that Abrams saw housing as the building block of an equitable world system where everyone, no matter how small their income might be, would find their way to a housing mortgage. For instance, his famous roof loan schemes, which is the origin of current microfinance mechanisms, provided loans to families who could not afford it or did not need a full house loan. Abrams observed that many squatter families, for instance, in Bolivia or Nigeria, could build their own houses with found materials, but materials for a good roof were harder to come by. The partial roof loan was inexpensive and allowed families to finish a house and protect it from rains and elements much more quickly and definitively than before. The story of Abrams' first overseas UN mission begins with, believe it or not, the design and construction of the Istanbul Hilton Hotel in 1951 by the well-known American architecture and engineering firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, under the direction of Gordon Bunshaft, working in collaboration with the prominent Turkish architect Sedat Hakkı Eldem. Early post-war projects of cooperation such as this one were carried out not through the agencies of the UN, as one might suspect, but through partnerships among US governmental agencies, banks, private foundations, professional firms, and agencies of foreign governments. The project's numerous symbolic functions aside, the Istanbul Hilton represented one of the best examples of collaboration between US agencies and the new Democrat Party, DP, administration in Turkey, which had toppled the 30-year incumbent, the Republican People's Party, in a landslide victory only the year before. DP had run on a platform to replace the Republican People's Party's statist economic policies with a liberal development program to reconstruct Turkey as a, quote, little America, capitalizing on Turkey's important geopolitical position as a linchpin state in the Cold War Middle East, to attract foreign aid and investment. In order to position Turkey as a regional economic power, Adnan Menderes, the DP premier, greatly accelerated urban reconstruction projects and renewal projects in Turkey's major cities, in major port cities, and especially in Istanbul. And you see the Hilton here, another to build on Cairo, the Tahrir Square example. You see Hilton here facing the Bosphorus here this is towards Marmara Sea and towards the Black Sea this way. And it's in the middle of a major urban reconstruction project and the creation of a boulevard, Cumhuriyet or Republic Boulevard, along here. And if we trace this path along Cumhuriyet Boulevard, that leads to the protest of the location of the recent protests, the Gezi Park and Taksim Square. And so it's part of that context. And and you see Adnan Menderes here approving some of the infrastructure projects. And this is a continuation of the Henri Prost plan for Istanbul 1937, opening up arteries throughout the city to connect and develop it as a world city. This bridge here is the bridge that you see here going across the Golden Horn, and the developments around Taksim and Gezi Park are over here. So negotiated within this context, and contrary, and here you see the Gezi Park developments and the Hilton right there. This is the, and prior to the building of the Gezi Park, these were the army barracks that Erdogan's government wanted to rebuild as a shopping mall back into that location. So just to kind of give you a history of that. That was what the protests were about. Negotiated within this context and contrary to what one might expect, the Istanbul Hilton was not a product of American corporate expansion. For instance, the Hilton Corporation did not provide the funds for the construction or the operation of the hotel. In the absence of any other local funding or mortgage structure for large construction projects, the DP borrowed from the Turkish Pension Fund, as they usually did with these projects, and the Economic Cooperation Administration borrowed from the Bank of America under the provisions of the Marshall Plan to jointly finance the construction of this pilot project. The ECA was established in 1948 to oversee the administration of the Marshall Plan. The building's aim was not to announce only to announce American presence to Soviet tankers carefully or sometimes not so carefully, navigating the currents of the Bosphorus below, or to provide a home away from home to American jet setters and businessmen. It was a pilot project to invigorate the construction industry, set up new finance mechanisms, standards of methods and materials, and other regulatory policies. One of the lesser recognized functions of the building as a hotel, among other functions related to the establishment of a tourism and hospitality industry, was to establish new standards of domesticity for the Turkish elite and the merchant class. Similar to the way the US agencies had rechanneled the production capacity of defense industry into housing and construction, ECA, Economic Cooperation Administration, was actively promoting the establishment of a transnational construction and housing finance industry as the backbone of national economies across the then expanding geography of the Marshall Plan. One of the strongest evidences of this activity is that SOM, a firm that had worked closely with US departments on large-scale and fast-track projects during the New Deal and the construction of manufacturing towns during the defense industry, such as the planning of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the home of the Manhattan Project for the development of the atomic bomb, prepared an extensive report for Turkey on construction, town planning, and housing while they were engaged in the design of the hotel. In this report, the SOM team advised the Turkish government on a number of topics related to the establishment and standardization of a construction industry, including the creation of a national planning agency in housing, construction, and planning that would act as ECA's counterpart in Turkey. Towards the establishment of this agency, SOM recommended that the Turkish government would work closely with corresponding UN and US agencies and invite experts to advise Turkish ministries in establishing housing finance structures and regulatory standards such as zoning and building codes that would enable the feasible operation of an insurance industry as well. The Hilton project had aligned perfectly with DP's aims. It was an immediately visible project carried out through partnerships among US and Turkish public and private agencies. DP perceived the SOM report as a type of planning that the US had itself moved away from during the post-World War II period. As promising as the Hilton project had been for the US-Turkish economic partnership, the SOM report marked the beginnings of a contentious divide between the Eisenhower and the Menderes administrations. It was only when both US and UN agencies began to require a central planning agency be established in each participating nation that the DP began, although reluctantly, to pursue the idea of a national planning agency. Almost 3 years after the SOM report, Abrams arrived in Ankara in September 1954 on his first overseas UN mission to, quote, advise the Turkish government on a variety of subjects, including zoning problems, finance, and a number of other aspects of housing and planning, end quote. Abrams was, by and large, an ideal expert to lay the foundations of a national planning agency along the lines defined by SOM and strengthen the state apparatus to regulate development and housing planning and construction. Just prior to his mission in Turkey, Abrams had prepared a report for the UN, applying the principles he had set forth in his book, Revolution in Land, to the context of international development. In this report, Abrams showed that housing, land tenure, and land use policies and practices would play a central role in determining the path and outcome of social and economic development programs during the post-war period. Regarding the question of planning, Abrams argued that sound policy development and construction of an equitable state apparatus were crucial, especially in developing countries. In the body of his report, he articulated the underlying concepts of his position. He explained that what was commonly referred to as the Industrial Revolution was made up of 4 interrelated revolutions, which he identified as first, a political revolution, second, a land revolution, third, an industrial revolution or revolutions, and fourth, a welfare revolution. He argued that the industrialized nations experienced these revolutions rather successively and over a relatively long period of time, and that the construction of a sound state apparatus was all the more important in developing nations because they would experience these revolutions simultaneously, threatening the positive impacts of any social and economic development programs. In this report, one can sense that Abrams was projecting America's own insecurities about capitalism to the developing world. New Deal fears of the rise of Reds and the unemployed masses in urban centers found a new home within the context of the Cold War. While post-war Europe and the developing world became the new unemployed masses, so to speak, mythical connections between property ownership, decentralization, and democracy were once again proposed as the cure. Abrams's report also contained the core arguments of what I have come to refer to as, quote, policy regionalism during the post-war period, which once again contained traces of New Deal regionalisms. Arguing against universal models, Abrams showed that policies developed in one setting could not be applied to another, and that extensive studies of local codes and practices were an essential component of sound policy development. However, in Turkey, Abrams observed that Ministry of Public Works was not interested in policy recommendations in housing finance without capital contributions from the United States. Abrams found himself in a position to completely reinvent his approach to policy within the politics of technical assistance in Turkey. A solution emerged during an unofficial meeting with Vecdi Diker, a US-trained civil engineer and former founding director of the National Highway Agency of the former administration. As a high-ranking former technocrat, Diker was familiar with the underlying aims of the state. Without going into too much detail here, Diker suggested to Abrams that if he were to propose his policy recommendations in the form of a UN-sponsored technical university to be established in Ankara, he would get the administration's attention. Diker knew that the establishment of such an institution in the nation's capital had been a long-awaited project. Indeed, to the utter surprise of other UN agents operating in Turkey, Abrams was able to secure a meeting with Fatih Rüştü Zorlu, the acting prime minister of the Democrat Party, and received the support to pursue the project. Abrams also met with Avra Warren, the US ambassador to Turkey, and resident representatives of ECA in order to secure US funding for the project. ECA offered support to the project as long as its scope could be limited to a research institute in housing and construction, along the lines suggested earlier by SOM. Without committing to anything specific, Abrams maintained the interest of all parties, while he also recruited Holmes Perkins, Dean of the School of Fine Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, to head the next UN mission to establish a new School of Architecture and Community Planning as the initial department of what would become the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. Perkins formulated the unique curriculum of what would become the most ambitious and complete project of transnational planning cultures of the 1950s. In this curriculum, all entering students would take courses in housing and planning during the first 3 years. They would then branch out to areas of specialization in architecture, community planning, public administration, and the various areas in engineering. Also based on ECA's primary aims, 2 research institutes were established as part of the School of Architecture, one in housing and the other one in construction techniques and materials, in order to position the school as the think tank serving the construction industry and the state through innovation and policy development. Perkins was also given the task of spatializing this new paradigm of development in the form of a university campus. The primary departments of Perkins's interdisciplinary program were positioned around the central core here, that he liked to refer to as the forum. The Department of Public Administration, the main library, and the Departments of Arts and Sciences comprised the primary buildings of the central core. The Departments of Engineering were positioned along the outer slope, as they were seen secondary to the central aim of the project. Their location was also to provide room for their future expansion, though. The School of Architecture and Planning, as the key component of this infrastructure and the link between the industry and the state, was positioned slightly away from the central core and enjoyed a prominent location at the edge of the hill overlooking Ankara and the Turkish Grand National Assembly. Here's the architecture school looking as a view of that. This visual and symbolic connection between the school and the state reflected METI's role as the training ground for the formation of a national planning agency. National Planning Agency, an essential component of the idea of indicative planning recommended by US and UN agencies. From the top of this Acropolis, formed at the Cold War frontier, a transnational managerial elite wielded a definitive power and authority over the capital and territories of the state, which was perceptible enough from the other side, from the state, to threaten the legitimacy of existing bureaucrats, and this would come back to haunt the project a little bit later, although the university was established. At the same time, the positioning and the configuration of the university as an isolated and autonomous community was indicative of the school's areas of investigation and approach to urban and rural development. Following a brief training in basic design, that you see here, which focused on formal studies and abstractions of everyday vernacular household objects, projects moved rather quickly from the formal to the social front of housing and community planning, carrying out some of the first studies in peripheral zones in what was then becoming squatter areas in and around Ankara's citadel. But the studies soon moved even outside of Ankara. The idea was to slow down migration from rural to urban areas by bringing development to the peripheries. Working with multidisciplinary and international teams supported by U.S. Agency of International Development, USAID, OECD, UNESCO, Ford Foundation, the school designated 16 distinct development zones within Turkey based on industrial, natural, cultural, and historical resources. And I'm wrapping up here. The studies surveyed the cultural and economic resources of a region as a whole, creating valley sections, to use the term by Patrick Geddes, who was without a doubt one of the influential minds behind the conceptualization of American regionalism during the first half of the 20th century. They would examine the region's geography, history, demographics, social life, settings and rituals, economic and cultural resources, and production and healthcare and education systems, as well as building materials and methods, of course. These surveys, followed by design-build projects to meet the various needs of a village or a town, yes. During the summer of 1957, in the first project for Ala, a village near Köyceğiz, located in the southwest region of Turkey, they developed a new town center with a mosque, coffee house, shops, open-air theater, and houses. Abrams, after setting the METU project in motion in Turkey in 1954, went directly to Ghana, which was then at the brink of independence but was still called the Gold Coast, where he proposed the establishment of another school, and the United Nations Housing and Town and Country Planning Agency, which was the agency that Abrams was working for, initiated a number of other projects in training and education, in housing, in a number of other locations in South America. I traced this in my broader work. METU, by and large, continues to be the most complete manifestation of the idea of configuring housing and planning as the underlying structure of post-war development. The impact of its preoccupation with peripheries, perhaps at the expense of the center, is an important factor to consider when thinking about the conceptualization of ideas about urbanism at the global scale during the second half of the 20th century. At the same time, its focus on the development of the country as a whole to curb speculation of capital in urban centers, once a dominant paradigm, is now largely marginalized. I'm going to, that's the part that I'm skipping, but it's now marginalized. The focus is now back on the center and on capital production, with public dissent and protest perhaps its only remaining regulatory mechanism, as was the case back in Haussmann's Metropolis. So, thank you.
And now we'll hear from Brenda Chalfin, who's from University of Florida.
Hi, everyone. I really do want to join the rest of the presenters in thanking Miriam and Erdag, Ayman, and I'm sending a special thank you to Era. Era and I actually went to high school together decades ago, many decades ago.
It was 15 years ago.
So who would have thought that we're both anthropologists, we're both doing urban work, infrastructure work. But I recently found out that Lewis Mumford was also a graduate of Stuyvesant, so maybe it was somehow preordained.
It was the drafting we did.
Yeah.
Year of drafting.
Right. So this is the last paper of the last session, and I want to make sure I do bring things back to Sasson. I've also changed the title and the topic of my paper from what is listed in the program. After hearing the papers yesterday, I really wanted to share something that spoke to the infrastructure theme, but connected this larger discussion to global cities and to Sasson. So in this panel, we're certainly bringing to the surface Sasson's essential infrastructural orientation. It's a key move in her scholarship. Maybe it hasn't always been recognized as such. Did she foreshadow even what we're calling in anthropology now the infrastructural turn? The work on cities is obviously anchored in the urban built environment, spaces of work and residence and leisure that provide this armature for the concentration of global network functions. And alongside this prominent, if taken for granted, infrastructural overlay, Sasson was among the first to bring a more humanistic and social science sort of framing of the deep structures of financialization, these embedded or more invisible infrastructures of financial flows and transactions. The city that I'm talking about today, Ghana's city of Ashaima, is pretty far from the front lines of the kinds of economic globalization examined by Sasson in her work, Global Cities. And it's also far from those second-string urban centers in her edited volume, Global Network-Linked Cities. And Africa is conspicuously absent in this work. It's barely mentioned. There's only about one sentence that remarks that London is an extramural financial sector for Africa, with Paris operating the same way for Francophone Africa. it is a sign of both the oversight of the age and how quickly things have changed in the scant dozen years since its publication. Africa's global urban profile is indisputable. There's numerous megacities: Cairo, Lagos, Joburg, Kinshasa, Nairobi, Khartoum. And they're all marked by demographic concentration and these highly networked circuits of persons, capital, commodities, and global influence, some of which is official and some which is extra state. Now, Ashima has only recently been established as an autonomous municipality, and it boasts a different global genealogy that in fact precedes the global urban boom made possible by the unfettered financialization of multinational capital in the closing decades of the 20th century. And so is this, where am I? There we are. This is quite remarkable because Barak and I never had a conversation before yesterday. The history of Ashima is much, much closer to the post-war Turkish developments that he has just described. And Ashima's urban existence is a byproduct of mid-century internationalism. Ashima's urbanity is coincident with the founding of the planned port city, yet another connection, of Tema, which itself was a satellite of the then colonial and now national capital of Ghana, Accra. Tema was built at the cusp of independence at the behest of nationalist visionary Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and it was designed and engineered and executed by the Athens-based Doxiadis Associates, a firm that was involved in post-war urban planning the world over, from the capital of new nations such as Pakistan, he designed Islamabad, in fact, to establish industrial hubs such as Detroit. And Doxiadis and his firm was a proponent of a global urban model based on a kind of scientific theory of acoustics. And this first slide that Barak showed of Abrams was from Doxiadis' journal. So the interconnections are really quite interesting and deep. Tema was intended to set the standard for African decolonization, co-equal with the material trappings of modernization. And there were a series of expansive infrastructural investments that marked the city's built environment: the port complex, an industrial area, prefabricated housing with adjoining schools, parks, and marketplaces, a huge hydroelectric facility, a rail system, a high-speed motorway, and even a centralized sewage system. And that was going to be the topic of the other paper. And lured by the promise of wealth and opportunity, people flocked to Tema in the late 50s and 1960s. But there was this catch-22 of de novo urban development. The new city couldn't be built without workers, but the support of a labor force required the basic trappings of urban life: housing, markets, water supply, and transportation. So with just a few labor camps, initial provisions were inadequate to demand. Let's see if this works. Okay. And it was Ashima that filled the gap. It was about 6 miles from the heart of the planned city, and it was posed as a perfect bedroom community to this still largely imagined metropolis of Tema. Ashima is, in the urban lore of Ghana, assumed to be kind of a spontaneous urban settlement. And in many ways, it was the antithesis of Tema, yet it was likewise orchestrated by the city's planning authorities. And in fact, the very materials from which the settlement's original structures were wrought were in fact Tema's rubbish. They were designated and transported for use in Ashima by government resettlement officers. And Ashima's first urban chronicler writes that the area had a population of just 185, according to the 1948 census. By 1960, there were 300 houses and nearly 3,000 residents. The fortunate among the settlers were permitted to salvage building materials after the bulldozers knocked down the houses in Old Tema. And about 95% of the original housing in Ashima were built out of salvaged iron sheets. Other than that, Ashima had no master plan and little concerted infrastructural investment. If we fast forward 50 years, however, to the 21st century, Ashima is now the capital region's main migrant catchment area. It bridges its whole urban, suburban, and rural fringe of the Accra metro region. And this city is seen as a gateway to economic opportunity. The recorded population right now is about 250,000, but the unrecorded population, when you bring that in, it could well be twice that amount. Hard to count due to their very transient. Ashima's footloose populace remains predominantly male, and it draws from a broad swath that extends across West Africa and into the Sahel. And I'm trying to understand kind of the processes and dynamics of urban growth and development in Ashima through the lens of some recent work in African studies that addresses the crisis in social production that's signaled by some of this migration, and especially its gendered dimensions. So there's some interesting work on this by Jim Ferguson, by Philippe Duboc on the Congo, and even by a Duke PhD, Danny Hoffman, who works on men's lives and social reproduction and crisis in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And Ashima, central to this demographic and socioeconomic mobility and both the making and mediation of crisis, is a movement of commodities as residents tap into the intensification of material flows that is brought forth by Ghana's overall economic growth, worldwide capitalist expansion, and just the ascendance of this city. As researchers point out for other African cities, a byproduct of these expansive social and commercial circuits is the proliferation of waste. And Ashima's vast core of unanchored persons subsists on the temporary and the disposable. Packaged meals that are purchased and eaten street side, single servings of soap and cigarettes and water sachets, pay-per-use public toilets and bathhouses, short-term jobs, and unstable accommodation. Those with greater affluence exercise the purchasing power of disposable income, and they're vulnerable to a different kind of economic uncertainty. They turn to the daily consumption of what were formerly considered luxury commodities. The members of this sector of the urban populace invest their wealth and identity in higher priced items and leisure items, even as the durability of these goods is reduced in the wake of capitalist overproduction, easy credit, and rapid intercontinental transportation. So I think of those ports in China. These varied material circuits converge at Ashima's dump, which is pictured here. And it's a vast tract of land on the main perimeter road. It's known as a waste transfer station. The far edge of the lot borders the forested buffer zone of the Accra-Temer motorway, and we really have a sea of trash that extends to the tree line, a mess of overflowing dumpsters. Cows roam between the garbage piles. There are dilapidated structures and dump trucks and carts. All of the waste from Ashima's household shops and market stalls is brought here before it's hauled to an engineered landfill at the district's edge. As a case of waste management installations elsewhere, there is order here. There's a division of duties, a division of items, a division of authority, and a division of value. Like every site of human action and interaction, it's also a place where meaning is gleaned and lives are made. This is amply true for the young men who work out their trajectory of geographic and social mobility through their labors at the dump, turning the detritus of urban life into the basis of material and ultimately social attainment. Those who labor here are actively invested in the transformable and transformative properties of waste. As in the case of waste workers described by Karen Falk in a very interesting book called Economies of Recycling, she states, through the material conversion of waste, these groups enact a revaluation of themselves and of the things they work with. Here, with the possibilities of the future looming larger than the degradations of the present, Ashaima's young male dispossessed seek to build a durable social trajectory through their union with spent things. Like the young men in the poverty and corruption-ravaged neighborhoods of Kinshasa described by Dubuc, the instantiation of the laboring male body as a form of urban infrastructure creates possibility in the context of extreme uncertainty. But unlike the Congolese case, which is marked by the near total evacuation of state authority and public provisioning, within Ashaima's dump, the physical labors of waste workers become fused with the officially managed and sanctioned infrastructures of the city. And the dump belongs to the Ashaima Municipal Authority. It's managed by Zoom Lion, a large private waste collection firm that has gained a hold of municipal waste contracts across the country. Throughout the morning and early afternoon at the dump site, traffic flows in and out, and there's Zoom Lion's own dump trucks along with their workers who bring loads by bicycle trailer and cart and motorbike. It's an assorted group of mostly migrant young men who work here. They offload and they dispose of the trash for a fee. It's about 1 or 2 cedis, the equivalent of about 50 cents per job. And they work alone and in pairs. They unload, they sort the trash, and they recycle and they resell what they can. The work is physically demanding and it requires a tolerance for grime, odor, and all the decay of waste handling. Yet it is ultimately possible. And it's possible for these young men to make 15 or even 20 cedis a day, which is a respectable wage, provides enough money for food and daily living expenses, along with a surplus to send home or save and invest in more expensive items like phones and motorbikes. So what we have is kind of floating surplus population, if we go back to Marx, of the 21st century. These young men range in age from about their mid-teens to the mid-20s, and I'll just kind of run through their background very briefly. A few are from northern Ghana. One young man that I'll mention again, Idris, he's from an area near the Togo border. Another hails from northern Togo, yet he spent some of his youth in the Volta region of Ghana. We've got a recent arrival from Cabre in northern Ghana. I see Charlie here. Several of the young men are actually from Niger, not far from the Mali border, and they share a Zabarma language and heritage. And despite their Francophone origins, without any formal education, they don't speak French. So Hausa, which is the closest thing to a lingua franca here, it becomes a language of the interviews and interactions, was acquired by them while they were working in the markets of southeastern Nigeria. So there's a multi-local and highly mobile group of young men who converge here. Another one, if we go back to Sasha's paper, yesterday is from the working class neighborhoods of Abidjan. So this is a meeting point for people from across the subregion. Despite their different origins, there's a sense of connection and cooperation. Rahman, who's one of the Zoom Lion workers, explained to me, oh, well, this Cabre guy came, he told us he wanted to work, we didn't know him, but we gave him a chance. He says in Hausa, Muduka Gudani, we're all brothers, we're all one. And that's the way it operates. Marco, the man in the camo shirt in the background, he's identified as the boss. He's at once a representative, a ringleader, and the go-between. According to the younger men, they have to pay him a couple of cedis when they begin working at the dump, and he makes the call on who does what. Most of all, he has the right of resale on the recyclable waste. But besides this nominal assent to Marco's exactions and this baseline moral code of inclusion, the chance to work at the dump really hinges on material relations and a willingness to dive into the dump's dense materiality. The informal waste workers must be able to balance on the edge of these 9-foot-high containers, lifting bags of waste in rapid succession, stand atop the waste piles in the dumpster to ensure they're properly compacted, and tolerating the noxious scent and the risk of a fall. Just as trash moves from the specificity of household property to the generic entity of urban waste, the workers must surrender their bodies to the filth and material excess of the work environment if they are to get any benefit from it. Signaling this merging of body, waste, and wealth, as Idris, another worker, puts it, any kind of work is work. Yet here, belying this quest for an uncomplicated equivalence of different forms of work and wealth, the material and sensorial excess of waste is matched by the arduous physicality of waste labor and this attendant risk of illness, injury, exhaustion, and bodily breakdown. Besides offloading the waste once it arrives at the dump, packing it into the dumpster, collecting and repacking the debris and fallout, the trash crew spends hours sorting the waste, sifting through the contents of each delivery and dumpster and dividing items by material composition, condition, and value. The items are rough sorted near the dumpsters. Whatever can be salvaged or otherwise recycled or resold is brought over to the sorting bays, which are really a collection of old tubs and dismembered refrigerators. They're worked over, compacted, and divided up again and moved forward up in this next step of the cycle of de- and recomposition. Idris, the fair-colored guy from northern Ghana, and his compatriot Dogo from Niger are working at the bays. Each bin is reserved for a different material or type of item. There are piles behind them, mostly fragments of plastic buckets, cups and bowls, and sundry other items. They sort them and pack like finds into large sacks. Idris wears work gloves along with a sporty pink watch, both retrieved from the dump. He folds, stomps, and compresses the various pieces of metal so they fit into the narrow bag, inspecting each item along the way to see how to best reshape it. After a couple of hours of work, Idris and Dogo carry the heavy bags over to Marco and the makeshift weigh station at the edge of the site. Heavy, rough-hewn logs form a scaffold with a rusty spring scale. Marco stays in place while Idris and Dogo haul the bags into the hook. The bags weigh about 50 pounds. Marco enters their weights into the cell phone. The boys are paid per weight regardless of the content, freeing Marco to sell the bags up the waste processing chain. In addition to the loads of plastic discards, the sorting bay is filled with metalware, bowls, pots and pans, umbrellas, and discarded housewares of all sorts. There are electronics, television, and computer screen parts, including a radio the guys test. Save for the few items made in Ghana and neighboring Nigeria, this is all the detritus of more far-flung global flows. Reflecting consumption habits, but also the conditions of production and exchange, most of the goods are China-made. They also come from the Middle East and North Africa and Dubai, wherever they're cheapest in price, quality, and transport costs. There are tomato tins ranging from single-serving size to extra-large, sardine cans, corned beef containers, soft drink cans, plastic bottles. There's even all of these car parts and bike parts. On the day of my visit, there were several bags of motorcycle batteries next to the sorting bays. So in this palimpsest of globalized consumerism, shaped by globally mobile things and consumption standards, it's apparent that accelerating in step with the Scheinman's residents' aspirations and purchasing power is this process of material decline, rendering the functionality and thus the possession of global commodities all the more fleeting. At the same time, the very accessibility of these items is afforded by their diminished quality and their consequent likelihood of breakdown. So what I'm really saying here is that consumption and breakdown are really a single process. And while it's perverse, this underwrites a kind of release of surplus value by way of negation. The material failures of global flows are full of possibilities for those who glean their livelihoods through the work of waste. Heightening consumption and hastening breakdown augments the range, volume, and rate of items moving through the dump. There is more waste to process and hence more money spent by municipal authorities and waste collectors on the services of these waste workers. Alongside the opportunities for income generation that make waste work viable, that is, livable or life-giving, a secondary stream of self-making is possible at the dump. And the young men at the waste site gain a visceral sense of the trappings of socioeconomic attainment through this intimate awareness of the inventory of material possibility. Case in point, those working at the dump reported that they could identify or at least imagine the status of people based on what is found in their garbage. One stated, well, we can see if the garbage comes from the house of a rich person. And Dogo said, come on, isn't it the rich person who drinks plenty of ideal milk? Though these waste workers, day in and day out, bear witness to the vast magnitude and inevitability of material breakdown, they retain the hope and in rare cases attain the actuality of material possession. There are these everyday finds of limited value, such as Idris's watch or bracelet spotted by Rahman, which he first offered to me and later decided to give to a friend. There is more substantial treasure for the taking, too. The waste crew mentioned pen drives and phones, and there was a collective memory, or more likely a collective fantasy, of an unexpired bottle of champagne they drank right at the dump. Adding to this lore of waste work, the workers also reiterated a tale of 2,000 cedis, about $1,000, found in a black polythene bag that was mixed with trash. So like the Kula trades that give birth to a bonus valuable ready to start an exchange circuit of its own, these mysteries finds, seemingly propelled by their own animus, to some extent signify a fetishism of waste. Even in the absence of such spectacular finds, waste work can contribute to an improved standard of living or an approximation thereof. When I returned here after a year-long absence, I immediately noticed a set of structures adjacent to the sorting bays. The exterior resembled the typical compound house. There was a wall around the entire structure and a swinging gate, as well as a shaded seating area. The structure was assembled out of wood scraps, tarps, and rusted and graffitied sheets of corrugated zinc, perhaps not too different from the cast-offs from Tema that were given to Ashaima's settlers by city authorities way back in the 50s. A truck hood, if you look closely, formed the wall of the veranda. The shaded space held molded plastic chairs, and a radio was suspended from a pillar just high enough to reach from a sitting position. There was a clothesline and a doghouse. Peering around the corner, I could see a curtained doorway marking the entrance to one of the rooms. Foam mattresses were piled together in a corner. Suitcases and sleeping mats were salvaged from the mix. The worksite and sorted mounds of trash were just a few steps away. As if a scene of deconstructed domesticity fueling its own aspirational reassembly, there were dedicated piles for television frames, buckets, jerry cans, and buta, the plastic teapots used for ablution before prayer. So to conclude, in Ashaima, the breakdown of things instigated by global capitalism's accelerated rhythm of creative destruction, and necessary for waste workers' own wealth accumulation, depends on the reproduction of durable male bodies. And indeed, the whole operability of Ashaiman's waste management systems hinges on the resilience of the collectively built and embodied infrastructure of the dump's youthful workforce, even as they are exposed to its risks and degradations. Though it may be less physically and aesthetically dramatic than other cases, such as the disciplined productions of embodied kind of infrastructures of maleness that can be found among the young men of Kinshasa, described by Dubuc, those of Sierra Leone and Liberia's war zones, described by Hoffman, nevertheless, the Ashaiman case offers some kind of middle ground between these extremes of near total exclusion of the urban Congolese youth from productive labor and this extensive exploitation of Sierra Leonean and Liberian forest fighters and mine workers that Hoffman talks about. Instead, we see how these young male waste workers in Ashaima are part of a global capitalist nexus, but only partially so. They trade the promises and perils of intensive violence and resource extraction on one hand, and endemic insecurity of livelihood and self-formation in the context of near total political collapse. I'm making the comparison between Congo on the one hand and Liberia and Sierra Leone on the other, and Ghana some kind of middle ground, for the mere uncertainty of underemployment and exposure to the chronic risks of waste work. unlike the unemployed men of urban South Africa described by Ferguson, who depend on government-issued basic income grants for their status and subsistence, in Ashima, we see the accursed share of global capitalist surplus. We see how it must be extracted from waste and built into and around the body before it becomes socially invested and redistributed. So here, in these kind of globalized landscapes of waste, we see how infrastructure is vital to urban functioning, and the way infrastructure is vitalized by and through urban bodies. And that's kind of what I want to leave you with, the vitality of infrastructure and all of its different resonances, and how that's really an essential piece of the global city today, whether we're in a very peripheral location, such as Ashima, or perhaps in other parts of the world. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So we have about 10. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes, and then we'll have the broader panel afterwards. Can I have all the speakers up? So what I'd like to do is sort of cache a couple of, I'll take a few questions in series just to make sure that questioners get their answer, and also to allow for, if there's a broad, if there are any questions for across the panel.
Yeah, it's happening now, not even just in the future of 5 or 10 years. Mostly the projects are including rail developments, not the inner city, but cross city, sort of intercity type of transportation infrastructure, but also energy type of infrastructure.
Can you talk about which cities that you see the most funding resources going to?
It's actually quite homogeneous in the Western region. It's not. I mean, the central government is not picking just one or two cities for the investment, but it's quite in terms of the spatial distribution. It's quite homogeneous into the Western, spreading out to the main cities at the provincial level. Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm wondering if any of you have questions for each other. I mean, you two are, your papers are so close, but are there any questions across the panel or internal to the panel? Or you two? Oh, there's someone. Oh, sorry. Yes, please.
I was wondering, is the site in Ankara that you mentioned was meant to, isn't that the site where there were protests recently?
Yes.
Like the state wanted to put a road through the campus or something? I wonder how that relates to sort of the afterlife of this planet.
Sure, yeah. Actually, that was kind of happening around the same time as the Gezi Park protests, and the mayor of Ankara wanted to actually open part of the larger campus site of METÜ to speculative development by bringing a major highway through the campus site, and and the students, which are politically very conscious, which is kind of another interesting topic, why the METÜ students and faculty they have a very kind of anti-globalizing kind of consciousness, political consciousness, and they protested and actually held the development back for the time being. But the city is encroaching into the campus land. There are sort of buildings here and there around the edges that begin to encroach into that land, and it's also there are no funds provided for the for METÜ to for them to develop their own land properly. There are vast tracts of land that are actually left to sort of herds of dogs that is actually dangerous for the students to wander through. It's a beautiful landscape that actually won an Aga Khan Award for forestation of that area, which Ankara was, there was no trees in that area, but METÜ took the initiative to actually turn that whole area into a green landscape. and there's a lake area which is very popular with the students. But yes, which is a great topic to get into. That's a great question. Thank you. In terms of how the city is trying to open that land to development. Yeah, that's to speculative development. Yeah, thank you.
Miguel. Oh, sorry. I should start taking them in series if I have more than one. So Miguel and then Miriam.
It's very interesting how we kind of organize somehow, because we have like the macro dimensions of planning in a place like China, in which you see investment by state, like top-down kind of investment in infrastructure for the commons, right, in terms of development, all the way to subjects at the end of the chain, right, in the processing of waste. But Greg said something really interesting, is that, and we come to our keynote speaker to this, is we have these two lines going on. One is like big development, urban development planning that is connected to economic development, urbanization, rapid urbanization, public-private partnerships, capital, fixation of capital through massive investment, and the creation of these cities. And Jota said yesterday, he showed us this couple of graphs about what is happening in terms of slum cities, right? Cities, right, can be planned, but at the same time there are rings and rings of people that are coming that can not be integrated within this economies of man-made natures, like, urban environments, built environments. And at the end we have only people responding on the public space, right? The check and balances at the end comes through, we have to create spaces of to stop this, we have bodies, really, the human bodies stopping, or at least delaying these processes through massive mobilization. Then my question is, in China, we know that massive mobilizations and political action has its problems because of the political structure of the country. But how check and balances regarding the people's choice to go to leave or not to leave or be part of this, right? We had some people talking about it. I don't want to be an urban dweller. I want to still be a peasant or not. But we were showing that, of course, younger people really like to be or change their status. Vis-a-vis people working in recycling, because we saw, for example, in the transformation of Bogota, at one point, how we call them the recyclers, right? Stopping at the center of the capital and delaying the processes of urban renovation in central plazas, right? And how empowerment comes also through this issues of, or subjectivity comes through marginalization. Or what I was saying, that yeah, there are some narratives of urban master plans and development, but at the end we have people coming, creating their own organic infrastructures, sometimes not even with the basic infrastructure like roads or public services that comes later. Sometimes it comes later. Yeah, sometimes it comes first, and it creates this fixation of capital through highways. And sometimes comes later when the slum is gone.
Yeah, so
we have it after.
yeah, I just want to give Miriam some time.
I just have a very quick question for you. I'm wondering about the status of these young men, because I've been aware of these communities, which usually are not just men. So I'm thinking of Cairo and the Copts, who have an entire area of the city that is devoted to the organizing of garbage. Very, very clean, very, very organized, and it has status. Then there, in Yemen, it's in Sana'a, absolutely horrendous conditions. The reason I had to inspect before a Duke Engage group wants to work with them, you know, this is service learning, I guess. We were alarmed that our students were going to be going there. And then in Jakarta, the kind of wild array of young men throwing themselves onto mountains of garbage, and but all independent. So I was just wondering about the status of
Right.
your
Yeah,
young men.
some of this has to do with scale and also temporality and the kind of pace of transformation, because this kind of growth of the city and the growth of the waste and even these efforts to kind of manage it and centralize it, those efforts are new, and then you have the tremendous transience. So it's not like Cairo and the cops, because these young men, while some hang around, the idea is that this is kind of one step of a trajectory. They'll do this work for a while, they'll save up. The next rung is, if you get enough money, you get a motorbike, and then you run a motor taxi. So it isn't really considered a permanent occupation. And there is definitely status concerns, but because there's more and more kind of wealth and profit that's possible, that there's a potential for them to sort of recycle themselves. And they send money home to their families, they build houses, they save for marriage. So it's more the threat and the degradations of the work. I mean, there's some real health risks, and also because of their own profits, they partake of different forms of kind of pleasure and recreation, of drink and getting high, and these are all part of kind of experiencing the world as a young man. And for some of them, it really sort of undermines them. And there's another part of this whole story about people, you know, these two guys, one who's new and one who's been there for a while, with a very wasted body versus a muscular body, and how both of these things are possible in this site. But I think the social status is more transient, but I'm really interested in the way this kind of gets inscribed in the body and mediated by their bodies.
Just make a quick comment. So you talked about, you just mentioned recycling. I wonder if something happens when the name changes. So you start off and you're dealing with garbage, and then you're actually recycling, and there's a kind of respectability that comes
Right.
with recycling.
See, these guys are more they're the waste workers, so they are the sorters, and they have to give it over to the Marco, who's their boss man, and he recycles it, and he has access to a lot more wealth. But through their kind of daily work of just getting 50 cents for every load that they sort of unbundle, they start to accumulate wealth.
I'm going to take one more, but then let them answer. Maybe I'm going to take Charlie's, and then maybe Miguel, and you can answer Miguel and Charlie's as a panel.
Just follow up to the conversation with Brenda. So where does the recycling stuff go? Because in Togo, there's a whole sort of Chinese connection. And it goes back to China, and there's another mobility to these collectors too. They actually roam around the villages in the north. They're hired by a Chinese firm, and they roam around the villages to collect glass and so on. It gets recycled and sent back to China.
I don't know, but that's really, really interesting. I've got to find out if there's a Chinese connection.
Okay. Maybe you all can incorporate addressing Miguel's question when we take some more, just because in the name of time. So I want to, I had.
Actually, because we were supposed to break at 42.
Okay, so I have to stop them.
I'm hoping, though, that everybody would stay and bring your questions to the final panel.
Can they? Okay. Well, if you're a bad cop, then yeah, I can. I have my students here, so I'm biased and whatever else like that. So I hope that these questions can come back and maybe weave together. Okay, I'm good cop. Thank you very much. And, okay.